Hi guys, welcome back. Let's look at integrating a PHP and MySQL REST API with an Android application. PHP REST API backed up with a MySQL database is a very common schematic of an enterprise mobile application. When the scenario requires data to be stored in a centralized manner, then this architecture should be used. Otherwise, the local database in the mobile can be used for storage and retrieval of information. In this tutorial, we are going to be creating a PHP RESTful service to read data from a MySQL database table, in which we're going to be using the fragrance, uh, the Android shopping cart system, which is called the fragrance eShop video that's actually created some couple of weeks earlier, whereby we get to do a lot of things, display to the UI, get to add the particular item to the cart, and so on. Now we're going to take away the embedded raw JSON and point it straight down to the web API that we're going to actually create now. So this is going to be the starter code and the use code to actually get this done, which will be integrating the sync adapter to actually call this service and store the values to the SQLite database and get sync intermittently, probably every 4 or 5 hours. Looking at your PHP MyAdmin, if you're not familiar with PHP, I will implore you to take a crash course on PHP so you could actually understand how to use PHP and MySQL. But if it's something you've been acclimatized with, you can continue and shoot with me. PHP is one of the most popular web programming language for the server side, which we all know. Virtually almost all web developers know how to code in PHP. That's why I chose PHP for my web service backend. So this is the PHP MyAdmin console where you get to look at this like a first level built on top of the MySQL database. Invariably, this is your database, which you can see the rows and columns involved, just like any relational database, where you have the row on top, while the columns you get to have them. The columns, first column here is the ID, the second is the fragrance ID, the fragrance name, the description, image URL, price, and the user rating, while the rows will depict the items that were stacked right there into the columns. The first row is calling the Versace errors, and the description you can see with the point, or let's say the link to the image. We have the this sitting right there in a cloud, so this is just the endpoint. So the HTTP and the domain name that will actually be attached to these particular endpoints will be let's say will be constant for all values. So the only changing aspects right there in the image URL is the endpoint. That's why you have it this way. The price and the user rating. For the second row, you have the Burberry and so on. So this is just the structure, or let's say the overview of how the data is. We have up to 15 items from the ID, which is auto increment, as you can see. 15 items. This is right sitting on a live server using the MySQL database. You could also use XAMPP if you feel like. So you just have to point it using the IP to its appropriate link. And running the URL, which will actually point down to the web service, which we'll be talking immediately after this, speed out this bunch of JSON, which you could use a JSON formatter to actually read it more clearly. Let me just grab this, paste that right there, and process this so you can see. Cool, you have it set up, and you could see that all 15 items should be present. Yeah, that's just it. And one of the objects you get to have the ID, the fragrance ID, the fragrance name, description, image, URL, price, and user rating, and all wrapped around an array of the fragrances, just like what we have in the embedded raw JSON. But this is spelled out using the web service, so it's not hard coded. That's just the beauty of it. It's not hard coded. It's a PHP code that actually encode all these values to JSON formats for any client app to use, be it Android, be it iOS, be it the web application, can actually consume JSON. So that's just the structure behind full enterprise development of mobile application. So I'll actually be headed straight to Sublime Text, where I have the source code of the PHP backend server that actually gets the connection to the database, run around with the controller. Also, we have the REST handler to actually manipulate the REST service and so on. So I'll be taking it one after the other so that we'll be able to understand what this means. The DB controller, this is where you have the connection. These are all variables, if you can see. They're private variables. Just this is an OOP approach of PHP development, just like what you have in Java, where you have object-oriented programming, where you declare classes, you declare fields, at the same time methods, rather in a class, and so on. Just the same flow. So we have the connection variable. Host will be at the local host. This is for the user, the username. The password, if you're using root, definitely the password will be empty, and the database name. So now you want to make a connection to the database. This is a constructor, as we all know, rather in Java. And testing, if the connection variable is not empty, so it's actually going to make a connection. That's this keyword, which is just like what we used to have, this connection. So we now have an object of the connection, which is actually connecting to the database with the connectDB method. Now this method, what's it doing? This is the method right there. So this method is calling the MySQLite connect, trying to connect to the MySQL database, which passes the host, the user, the password, and the database. So those are the 4 parameters needed to connect to a MySQL database. Now it returns an object of the connection, which will be used in the course of all the code right there in this fragrances package or in this fragrances folder. Now you're going to execute the select query, which takes a parameter, which is the query. So it's actually going to take a bunch of query and execute it based on the connection, which is right there in this class. Now we have a result, which we're actually going to save the result of the query we ran. Now the connection at first from the MySQLite query. This is just out of the box for MySQL. These are all functions which you could call to interact with the MySQL database. And you're passing the query as the second parameter, and you're going to run that and pass that into the results variable. Now you're going to loop through this result and pass that into an array set. We're using the while loop while you fetched an associate array, which is predominantly to these results. You pass them to the row, and you actually this is actually going to come in a form of iteration. So at this time you get that done to an array, so it's actually going to be passed into an array. So that's where you could see an array of objects from the JSON. So that's just it. So it has the results are passed into an array. So that's just what that means. So that sets the DB controller up where you could execute your select query. At the same time, you could connect to the DB where you've actually declared the fields, which are very, very important. The connection, the host, the user, and the password, and the database name. From here, we head straight down to the fragrance PHP. This is a domain class to demonstrate the RESTful web services. You should hook up this with the DAO here. So that's just what we have. This is a class called the fragrance, and we have a private variable which is initialized to an array. as you can see. And now you're going to be using this. So we have an inner method called get all fragrances. So this is actually going to run the query. Get all fragrances. From the name, you should understand what this is going to do. So we have the query, and now we're going to run this. Select all from the fragrances table. That's just it. From the fragrances table. So the name of the table created, which you saw rather than the PHP MyAdmin, is called the fragrances. Now you need to instantiate the DB controller, which we saw right there, which actually houses the connection and the execute select query. So you should know the two methods, very important there: the connection to the MySQL database and the execution of the select query. Cool. So we instantiate that to create an object to interact with the methods rather than the DB controller class. This fragrance, which is the array which we have rather declared as a field, equals to the DB controller. Now the DB controller could point down to the method called execute select query, passing the query itself as its parameter, which you have there. Select all from the fragrances. Cool. And if you could remember, it's actually going to save that into an array using the while loop to loop through the row. So now you're going to return an object, which is the fragrance, which is an array, which you have here already because we're expecting an array from the DB controller, which is the result set. Cool. I hope that is understandable. So the fragrance PHP, the setup, now we have a call to the table to fetch all values from the table in question. Now how are we going to actually make this presentable as a link, and how are we going to actually encode this to JSON so we could actually have that speeded out. So we're actually going to be looking at now we've talked about the DB controller and the fragrance.php. Let's talk about the fragrance REST handler. This is the REST itself, which you're going to require two files: the simple REST, the fragrance.php. Before I get further, I would like to talk about the simple REST because this is needed for this class to run. So a peep to the simple REST. This is let's say a boilerplate template which you can build upon it for different form of calls to the server. You get different results where you get to set the HTTP headers. These are like bunch of code you could use in all of your web services code that you're trying to speed out because it's like a boilerplate. Set up for you. You have the set HTTP headers that take in the content type and the status code. But we all know what the status code is. When you're communicating with the web, there are always different status code that could be speeded out. We have the 101 switching protocols. We have the 404, which is not found. We have the 200. We all know 200. Definitely it's okay. That is a success. So we have the 201 created. So even if you've forgotten what those codes are, you could have that set up here. 502 bad gateway. 503 service unavailable. 504 gateway timeout. These are all status code which are out of the box. So you just have to have these ones saved somewhere. So anytime you need to create a web service, you just pick one of those files, set that up, and you're good to go. So that's the simple REST PHP. Still back to the REST handler. Now we require that, which is specified up there, and we also require the fragrance.php. We know what the fragrance.php is, which actually gets all the fragrances. That's the only method sitting right there. Now you need to extend the simple REST. Should all know extend at this point in time because we cannot use some of the methods right there in the simple REST class. So we have a method called get all fragrances. This is unique to the fragrance REST handler. It's different from the fragrance.php. You should all know that. Now you instantiate the fragrance class. You create an object called fragrance, which will be used. And at this point in time, you point the object to the method, right there in the fragrance.php called get all fragrances to speed all the arrays of data. Now you pass that to the raw data variable. So you test if the raw data is empty. Now what will be the status code? Probably 404. No fragrance found. So that is where you get a status code from the simple rest.php. So if it's successful, you're going to actually spit out a 200 status code. So 200 is always okay. Cool. Now we have the content type. What kind of content type are you trying to pass the data to? Are you trying to pass that data to XML? Are you trying to pass that data to JSON? So that's what that depicts. Now we are posting, or we are passing these values to a JSON format called application/JSON. So we need to also set the HTTP headers for the link, where we pass in the request content type, and you pass in the status code, which is 200, and the content type, which we're going to set up now. The results that you will be expecting to encode the JSON, you need a key here, which is actually going to be the key for the results. Call it fragrances. You could call it some other things. So that's what gives rise to this particular value, fragrances. This is what you see. That's the result. Cool. I hope you're understanding how this is getting formed out of the box. So let's head back straight to stop line and get rolling. Now the raw data is in an array. So you have it right there, an array. But we've initialized it to be an array already. So it's actually PHP is a lossless programming language. Probably if you are dealing with Java, you have to specify this to be an array. But since you've initialized with an array value, that's automatically points that variable you're talking about is an array. So you have that as a raw data passed into this array name called fragrances. You can see the bracket sign of an array. Cool. Now you're going to strip the position based on the application JSON. It shouldn't be false, and the response now should be what? You need to encode JSON. This is just like this class. You need to encode the JSON and pass in the result value, which is the arrays. So that is actually going to be encoded in JSON and formed to JSON. I put down formed to JSON in key value pairs. Now you echo out the response, which is actually going to be the bunch of this what you're getting. So now the encode JSON function, or let's call it the method, takes the response data as a parameter, and it's actually return the JSON response when you could have a code to JSON, just speed it out in JSON format. So we could actually call this method somewhere out there, which is this. You can see there's a method which we called. So this method actually get the response for us, which actually encode the values, the response data, which is the result of, which is the array, to a JSON format. So that's how you could see something of this nature in JSON key value pairs. So we've been able to structure it and set up a MySQL database, table values, format it, and speed it out right there in a JSON format out of the box. So that's very, very important. Let's move further. Now, what other things are we going to look at? We're going to look at the fragrance controller. Now we've had the data, we've had the values. Now let's have a controller which we could point at to actually get this speeded out for us. So you're going to require once the fragrance REST handler. I've talked about that just in the GV. That's where all the bunch of encode to JSON is being done. Now we have a view which is set to empty at the point in time. So you get a view. Now you need to control the RESTful services through the URL mapping. So we're going to have map a URL to that. So the switch case now for this particular view. The first case, if it's all, probably all data, you're trying to fetch all data from the backend, which is the select statement to select all from. Probably if you have another case scenario, probably you want to select a particular set of data. You could have the second case to have that done. So you just have to pass in those methods, probably a new query to select a particular set of data, or based on the ID you'll be getting. So that's just how the web service gets complex, bigger, robust, and be able to do some other complex activity. But basically now the first case here is just to select all of these values from the REST API. Where you need to instantiate the fragrance REST handler and call the get all fragrances. So any point at this all query is actually going to spit out all of those values we've been talking about, which is the fragrances item. So now looking at this link, if you notice, we point down to the fragrances, the fragrance controller.php. What is the query sign? View all, which we have right there. View, which is the switch, and all of the value is the case of the view. So if we probably have another pointer, we can actually change this. Probably want some set of data, few data, or so on. So it depends on how you really want to structure your backend web service. So with the few analysis, I hope you've been able to understand what it takes to create a RESTful API using PHP and MySQL. Now let's get to consume this in Android. I won't be going through all the Android code because I've actually had a tutorial based on the PHP, based on the fragrances eShop. So I'll just be pointing out where we needed to change and get that done. So head straight to Android Studio, and we're actually going to be using that in the sync adapter. I hope you're familiar with sync adapter. If you're not familiar with that, check out this link and get yourself acclimatized with sync adapter. So I'll only be pointing out the URL we'll be using. If you notice the URL now, it's still pointing out what we have right there, which spit out this bunch of JSON. Cool. So we have the URL stated over here, and now we know what we're expecting, which we've actually used a JSON formatter. Since we have a code of the same structure, we actually don't need to change a lot of UI functionality. We just need to tweak how it's been saved to the SQLite database. That's all. So with that, we're going to have that set up. So this is just the URL connection where we get to decompile further on the JSON expected. The only change here is what I really want to point out, which is the data format that we got from the API. The data format gotten from the API is basically strings values, but we need to still change them to the appropriate data type of the SQLite database in the app. For example, the price, we add that as string. I could still show you this from the JSON formatter. If you notice that the price is in string values, the user rating is a string, and this price should be double. The user rating should be integer. So that's just the few changes, but that's very trivial to do. So you just convert the price to the double, using the double dot parse double, and even the user rating, you use the parse integer, and also the item ID called the parse integer. So with that, all string values will be converted to their appropriate data type. Now this will be converted to double, this will be converted to integer, likewise the item ID. So that's just 3 changes how you'll be doing right there in the sync adapter. So with that, you're still good to go with the code you had from the previous tutorial. That's why I'm not really going to start explaining all over again. I will implore you to take your time to go through the fragrance eShop playlist. Is actually a playlist from the beginning. Let's get to understand what is happening right there from the beginning, so you can understand how this flows. So this is the sync adapter, which is used to actually consume these particular web services. So you actually consume that using this link. This link is very, very important. So you could still also build use the URL builder. Probably you want to add, you actually want to take away the view and all aspects. You could actually do this using the URL builder, and you add the values of the view to all and so on, instead of hard coding it with the link all through. But all the same, you're still going to spit out the right JSON this way. So with that, I believe you set and good, and you could actually follow up with the code and consume this. With this, the values will be saved to the SQLite database, most especially if you should look at this point in time where you put the fragrances values to the database. So now the values are saved, and once you call the content, once you call the sync adapter, uh, probably one after 1 or 4 or 2 3 hours, the value will only check out for its unique ID. I think I've explained that earlier, where the unique ID is the item ID. Let's get to look at the item ID, the fragrance ID over here, which is unique to each entry. So if there's no inclusion from the web service, there's not going to be duplicate data right there in the SQLite database. It's still going to maintain the same data. So unless if there's a new inclusion with a different fragrance ID, that's when the SQLite database will get to insert that to the database. So these are just little tweaks to actually make the relationship between Android application with web services coherent. So with that, you set and good to go. And I will employ you, if you have any issues, any challenges, most especially with the PHP code using the Sublime Text, the Simple REST API, the DB controller, the fragrance PHP, where you get all fragrances, the REST handler, where the encode to JSON is being done very importantly, and where we get to create the HTTP headers as well. And you could even use htaccess if your web service actually accept that. So this is actually going to point any values of REST controller.php, the query sign to view all. You could just pass that to this shortlist called fragrance list. So it depends on how your web service is being configured. If it's configured to use htaccess, you could do that. So instead of you calling this this link, you will just call the fragrance list. Cool. So that's for htaccess. So in our next tutorial, we'll be talking deeper, probably how to populate the SQLite database, which we see right there, which is the PHP MyAdmin. How could we populate this using a GUI, an interface? Probably we have an interface to set in the fragrance ID, the fragrance name, description, image URL, and just submit. And before you know it, it gets saved automatically here. So we could also delete. We could do the CRUD implementation, create, read, update, and delete from the MySQL database. So these are just two similar things. SQLite database, very similar with MySQL database. Just that MySQL database is sitting in a server somewhere, let's say, set up by yourself, while SQLite database is right there on the Android device. So that's just the two difference, all doing the same functionality. Thank you guys for hanging out with me throughout this tutorial, and I'll be commenting the source code so that you could just pick up the source code if you still find this hard to understand, or probably you're finding the client's Android app to get rolling with. You can pick up the source code from GitHub and get it acclimatized with and set it up on your machine and get it rolling. I'll also be uploading the backend PHP code so that you could actually understand this, and probably I might rip out the SQL so you could just submit the syntax through the SQL over here. Just submit the syntax, so the syntax will actually build up your table and build up the content which you have right there. So that's just it. Thank you guys one more time, and have a blessed time. Bye bye for now.